Well, thank you again, everybody, to this session, which is, I think, a session that on a topic that's talked about a lot in various parts of this COP, but also in other parts, other meetings and conferences all over the world. I think number 1, Africa, number 2, Congo Basin, and number 3, tropical forests and carbon credits in Congo Basin is just of huge interest at the moment. So great that we're organizing this session, and I just want to recognize the African Development Bank and your leadership, but more about that in a second. So I'm going to be introducing, just for a few minutes, my name is Kirsten Schuit, and I'm Director General of WWF International. I've been in conservation for about 25, 30 years, and a lot of time on tropical forests, and also spent a lot of time working in Africa. So accounting and valuing Africa's natural capital is extremely important for Africa, but also for the world. And it's very clear that at this moment, climate finance needs to be increased. It's inadequate, and I think we're all very much aware of that. It's estimated that about $460 billion is needed to halt and reverse forest loss by 2030, but the pledged finance is only 1% of this. So that's a tiny fraction of what's needed. And in addition to that, the finance gap in Congo Basin is more pronounced than in other places, parts of the world with tropical forests. WWF launched a report together with COMIFAC this week in Dubai that calculated that the finance for forests and environmental protection in the Congo Basin is only 4% of that which is being spent in Asia and in Southeast Asia and the Amazon Basin. So that is a massive gap that I think if we want to conserve the forests in Congo Basin, we really need to step up. And in bridging that gap, we need to utilize all our options, whether it's facilitating the disbursement of already allocated public money or expanding mechanisms that are working. And carbon markets can be a really important component of these options, especially bringing in the private sector investments into forest conservation. At the same time, we must also realize that this will only be effective as long as we put strong safeguards in place. The reality to date is, unfortunately, that a lot of the carbon projects that have been put in place have had questionable conservation impact, negative social impact, and are undermining the climate ambition. So in addressing these criticisms, we must make sure that we deliver on the Paris agreements first, that we work on high integrity and quality on the supply side, so in the projects as we develop them, which just require large upfront investments, right? In order to put the enabling conditions on the ground, like developing baselines, like setting up good governance mechanisms, like making sure that we focus on equitable benefit sharing of the benefits that come to the local communities. And lastly, we must support the capacities of indigenous people and local communities on the ground and making sure that they have all the information they need to make the decisions whether they want to be part of these projects and programs, and also making sure that the benefits, again, are shared equitably and equally amongst communities. So with this brief introduction, please allow me to welcome Professor Kevin Urama, Chief Economist and Vice President of the African Development Bank, who will set the scene and provide a brief overview of why it's important to include the value of natural capital in the measurement of GDP of nations. Thank you so much.
Good evening. I'm not hearing anything. Good evening, all. First, let me thank you for being here today. I know it's been 2 weeks of several days of lots of meetings at this COP, lots of working and getting fit from one pavilion to the other. And the fact that you are still here at this time and at this time of the day tells of your interest in the topic. First, this is an event on measuring Africa's green wealth, implications for the global carbon markets. It is really my honor on behalf of the African Development Bank to welcome our distinguished panelists. The moderator will call out their names later. For coming here to have this brainstorming on how we can improve the measurement of green wealth of nations and how this has implications for everything we talk about on climate change. Africa has been one of the fastest growing regions in the world during the last 30 years with, we keep hearing of GDP growth rates on the continent that are quite impressive, with 6 of the world's 10 fastest growing economies before COVID-19 being in Africa. But we also know that the current measures of GDP underestimates a lot of the assets that African economies have, especially in the area of natural capital. While GDP is undoubtedly the acceptable measure for checking how countries are performing with regard to the gross product, domestic products of countries, we also see that the externalities, whether positive or negative, that is created by that production often goes unmeasured. In most African countries, natural capital represents a huge chunk of that GDP, sometimes up to 50% of the national wealth as measured currently. Because the continent is endowed with significant assets, natural forests, oceans, geological resources, biodiversity, name it. We have a lot of that on the continent. But because of this poor measurement and accounting for natural capital in the wealth of nations, countries that are rich in natural resources are often cash poor. And that cash poverty has implications for their access to capital. It has implications for their capacity for adapting to climate change and also implementing the green transitions we're all very interested in. So these resources provide several services, ecosystem services such as carbon sequestration, pollution control, soil fertility, and all these things help to sustain the production that we measure in the GDP of countries. But the impacts of these economic activities that grows the economies of nations are often poorly measured or not measured at all. For example, if you have a forest that is sequestering carbon, that's a public good that is provided to the global economy, but the value of that forest is only to the extent that you cut down the trees and convert them to logs of wood that you export, or to furniture that is final products that is also exported. So, for example, the Congo Basin forest, popularly referred to as the second lung of the world after the Amazon forest, this we know acts as a buffer for global climate change through the carbon sequestration that happens in that forest. Yet, the GDP of Congo does not take into account that public good that is being provided. This represents a significant amount of public service rendered to the world, the global commons, which are not being monetized. At the same time, countries that may not have such huge assets that sequesters carbon may have other assets like technologies for carbon sequestration that are sold in the markets. And that counts for their GDP. So quite rightly, therefore, President William Ruto of Kenya, at the climate summit held in September 2023, reiterated that, and I quote, "The restoration and expansion of Africa's natural carbon sinks are not just an environmental imperative, but an unparalleled economic gold mine that has the potential to absorb millions of tons of CO2 annually, which can translate into billions of dollars to improve livelihoods across the continent," unquote. So this work we're doing with partners is trying to help us understand how better to pull all the work that's been done on natural capital accounting, ecosystem valuation, and other research in this area to start improving the accounting for natural capital and how the wealth of nations are measured. Hence, we call it greening the wealth of nations. In our own report, the African Economic Outlook Report 2022, we estimated that at the current social cost of carbon, Africa's total carbon credit, basically taking into account all these issues that we have talked about, could reach up to $4.8 trillion by 2050. And this is the credit that accrues to Africa if we considered the historical, current, and future shares of carbon emissions among all the nations. And by 2022, the Global Carbon Alliance the global compliance carbon market has grown significantly to over $850 billion. That's like a 250% growth from 2020, just within 2 years. And the voluntary carbon market has quadrupled in size to about $2 billion. But we do know that these carbon markets are very dynamic and are also not, the carbon price is not very optimal, depending on which market that you are talking about. And while these forests sequester gigatons of CO2 emissions, the value of that sequestration do not accrue to countries that own and manage and also conserve those forests. And the reasons for this are clear. We have knowledge gaps in the value of the carbon assets in the markets, the ability of the countries to measure that, and then also poverty driving the price of carbon in the global carbon markets. So we're having discussions with some of my Commonwealth colleagues yesterday, and one of them likened it to a market where the buyer defines the price. So if we find measures that we can then integrate both the positive and negative externalities that are produced by national green wealth, forests, ecosystems, and so on and so forth, we will be able to help improve how countries account for their impacts on the ecosystem. And there are a lot of work that has already happened that can allow us to do that. Several years of work on natural capital accounting has been going on across the world. The World Bank has also led the work on wealth accounting and valuation of ecosystems, WAVES, and that has already come up with statistics on several countries, including in Africa, in Botswana, Madagascar, Rwanda, Zambia, Uganda, Egypt, Morocco, and several parts of the world. And the African Development Bank also has done quite a lot of work in this area. So what we're trying to do now is to throw a challenge to us, the economists, the accountants, and all the people who are very interested in climate change to move the negotiations that we have on climate to practical methodologies that makes countries account for their impacts on the ecosystem and on the environment. So our basic points are clear. The public goods provided by natural assets, including carbon sequestration by forests and other ecosystem services, are not yet duly accounted for in the wealth of nations. And until we account for that, it will not be taken seriously in climate negotiations or biodiversity negotiations in all the COPs that we have, because the accounting for wealth of nations underpins national interests and drives the politics and the policies around environmental management. So by internalizing these values of natural capital and ecosystem services they provide into measures of the wealth of nations, we will significantly facilitate the green transitions. Specifically for Africa, Africa's natural assets and the public goods and services that they provide need to be fully accounted for. And this non-accounting for it must change. Ladies and gentlemen, with these few words, allow me to yield the floor to our able moderator so that she can introduce to us our capable panelists who are going to take us through the intricacies of how to make this happen. Because together, I'm sure we can make it happen. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Kevin. And well spoken, and I love your call for practical methodologies that lead to action. I think it's really good. So with no further delay, let me please introduce our panel. We have Dr. Nancy Laibuni, Associate Member Council of Economic Advisors to the President William Ruto. Please come up to the stage. We have Professor Naoko Ishii, Executive Vice President of the University of Tokyo. Please come to the stage. Mr. Gregor Saller, GIZ Senior Expert on Carbon Markets. And do we have the ambassador online? No? Okay, so welcome, panelists. And I'm going to start. We have the mic. So we have a bit more than half an hour, mostly to listen to you on the topic of carbon markets. Let me start, Dr. Nancy, with you, with the question, how can we best integrate natural capital into African countries' GDP, and what are the expectations, particularly from Kenya?
Thank you. Thank you very much for having us in this panel. I will give an overview of why it is important for us as Kenya to be able to measure and to account for our carbon credits and carbon markets. We recognize that Kenya is already a leader in the generation of carbon credits, and we have a potential to sequestrate around 30 million metric tons and to mobilize at least $600 million annually through regulation just from the voluntary carbon market. And we have seen between 2016 and 2021, the country has been able to sequestrate about 26 million metric tons of carbon dioxide and been able to account for more than 20% of all total African credits or credits that the African market has been able to get. We recognize that this is not significant. Nonetheless, it tells us that we have tremendous potential even as a country. And we are seeing that we are able, from the estimations that have been done by researchers, to at least be able to generate over 30 million tons of carbon credits worth, and this would go a long way in generating what we'd call green industries and even hundreds and thousands of jobs for Kenyan youth from the potential that we receive. Nonetheless, we recognize that for this to happen, we need to have a very robust and sustainable mechanism in which these markets operate, and so that they can be able to attract reasonable income and opportunities for the communities who are most affected by the vagaries of climate change. We also appreciate that in the recent past, as early as September this year, in the sidelines of the African Summit, or after the African Summit, we have enacted an amendment to our Climate Change Act, which we call the Amendment 2023. And here the amendment basically accounted for or provided a framework in which we'll be able to account for our carbon markets. And specifically, we amended our act so that we can account for the development and management and implementation of the regulation mechanisms. We can ensure that we are able to account for our markets also, so that then we are able to regulate and ensure that we are getting the most out of the carbon markets by providing guidelines and policy directions in which these markets operate. And more importantly, the issues around benefit sharing from the proceeds of these carbon markets. The Act has been amended so that we're able to account for how benefits are going to be shared and distributed. So moving on, I would like just to give some highlights of some of the important points that have happened in this year. In September this year, we had the first Nairobi-based emission platform launched by CYNK, and it's the first Africa-based end-to-end platform for the measurement, verification, and sale of high-quality, verifiable emission reductions. And we were able to sell 2 million credits. I think that information is available online, and most of this came from a group in Kenya called TAMU that produces the largest biomass, which comes from the sugarcane sector. Other examples that we have is the national Kenya Rangeland Carbon Project, which is also our largest open-grazed sustainable grazing mechanism, which is inspiring or hoping to achieve at least 7 million tons of carbon dioxide or pull or sequence carbon 50 million tons over the next 30 years. Some of these benefits of this project have already been accrued through issues around clean fuel and solar lightings around the systems or the homes or the ecosystem, the systems that surround these neighborhoods. So coming to our topic of today regarding measurement, how have we been able to account for this? We recognize that it is still a challenge and we are working towards it. In 2017, we prioritized 3 sectors: energy, water, and forest accounts. We acknowledge that we have been working towards developing accounts for these 3 sectors. It's been an ongoing development, and what we can report to date is that now we have a national plan for advanced environmental economic accounts, which is still work in progress. For the simple reason that it's quite data intensive, you need to get a good, large cohort of technical experts willing to put in time and resources into developing the data that can be used to account for this or to be able to account for it in the social accounting matrix, social system of national accounts that we use to measure our GDP. We also recognize that we have a national Africa community of practice around natural capital accounting. And Kenya this year hosted, again in the sidelines of the African Summit, hosted a conference where several issues were discussed, and what they declared, they developed what they call the Nairobi Declaration and call to action. So one issue that came out clearly from this conference, if you look at the declaration, they recognize that there's still a lot more work that needs to go into towards accounting for natural, helping countries, especially in Africa, account for natural capital in their GDP. Nonetheless, there's a lot of also goodwill from the governments, but there needs to be more institutionalization of this and building of the capacities of the technical staff to be able to do it. So in Kenya, we have institutionalized this process in our National Bureau of Statistics, which is our institution that does the computations for our GDP. But we recognize that they need continuous support and resources and technical assistance to be able to do so. So I think I could stop there from giving a highlight of where we are as a country.
Great, thank you. And yeah. Thank you so much for sharing that. And what I like is it's very practical, how you have set that up step by step. And I think your focus on expertise and the use of technical staff and institutionalization across the board are important lessons, I think, for many. So thank you for sharing that. So we go to the next panelist, Professor Naoko. The question that we have for you is how does the current economic system fail to adequately account for nature and value nature, and what are some of the challenges that we can address moving forward?
Yeah, thank you so much actually for inviting me to this very exciting panel. The reason is I think that Kevin and I shared a panel more than a week ago on some other session, and both of us happened to talk about importance of introducing natural capital accounting. And I hear that you would like to hear the practical lessons, a practical way forward, and maybe natural capital accounting may sound a little bit aloof. but then I'm now with the University of Tokyo. However, I have been the practitioner for 40 years, coming from Ministry of Finance, IMF, World Bank, and finally GEF. So the reason I am advocating natural capital accounting is not the academic reason. I think this is the game changer of our struggle to how to value the natural capital, which the African continent, has so much of it. And without really addressing this game changer, the accounting issue, we will continue to struggle to do the nice projects here and there in a very much fragmented way, with a lot of labor. Labor means the effort put into to make sure that each project is going all right. And while I was doing that, the thousands of projects when I was with the GF, I'm actually becoming sick and tired of having those small fragmented projects all over the world and seeing them not adding up to the system change. So I was actually wondering how we can really shift the system rather than making sure that doing the small projects fragmented, 80% of them are rated satisfactory, then why system doesn't change? So that was my question. So that's why I promote, as Kevin did, how the system can incorporate the external, actually the externalities into it when we make an economic decision making. That's why this natural capital accounting, in my view, is actually shifting the system. So that's a fundamental reason. And as already mentioned by previous speakers, Africa has so much of the natural capital which has not been accounted whenever you do the project to actually the debt issue that you have in many of the African countries are suffering the debt crisis. But if you are able to value the natural capital, the scene looks completely different. You have so much to offer the world in terms of investable opportunities, which is not really there yet. So my proposal is really to, in addition to do those nice and nature-based solution projects and the product here and there, let's also think about the bigger picture and how to really shift the system, mostly through introducing the natural capital accounting. And as already mentioned by Kevin, some of the countries already do have the natural capital accounting, but they are sitting at maybe statistics department. How that the Ministry of Finance, that the financial community can use it. So how you can really make the bridge of somewhere sitting in the statistics department to the Ministry of Finance, to the investment community, how we can really create it. Just as a final information, out of this frustration, out of this, compassion, that the 6 women have just published this report, Financing Nature, a transformative action agenda. And actually, out of 6, one is me, but Franny Rotier, Bella Sonwe are from your continent. And we all share this passion that while doing good projects, we also have to be extremely ambitious and think about what are the lever, what are the game changer, so that the world, that the financing world can really take account of the value you have on the continent. And if we were able to create this natural capital as an asset and put it on your balance sheet, the system, it will be completely changing, and your guardians, the steward that you holding this natural capital, be it the smallholder farmers, that the forest community, that the indigenous people, will be rewarded, not just by transfer, not by compensation, would be rewarded of their effort to safeguard, steward those global commons. That's a dream I think that I do have, and let's really work towards that direction. Thank you so much, Christine.
Thank you so much. Thank you for making such a passionate plea for national capital accounting. And I agree with you, it's not abstract. This is the game changer. That may change the economic system, which we know is undermining, I think, a lot of the sustainability activities that we're all trying to undertake. So thank you for that. So to the last panelist, Gregor Saller from GIZ. A question for you is why carbon markets are an important source of development finance in Africa, and what are the challenges to the development on the continent?
Yeah, thank you for this question. Thank you for my very eloquent predecessors. Yeah, carbon markets. Well, maybe let me first start a bit with differentiating a bit and digging into the topic. Because one of the challenges, to start with that, is that, let's say, different things are packed under the same wording and are treated as the same thing. But I think it makes sense to differentiate a bit. So under the umbrella of carbon pricing, putting a price on carbon, there are different ways how to do that. There's on the one hand the allowance system or also carbon taxes, where you basically price carbon in the sense that you have to pay for it in a sense of an allowance, as a punishment, if you want to say so. And on the other hand, we have the carbon credit markets. And I guess we are focusing now on the carbon credit markets. When we look at the carbon credit markets, we currently have national carbon credit markets and we have the voluntary carbon markets. And then there is the compliance market under Article 6, which is very much still in the making. Article 6.4 is a huge topic of debate in the negotiations here. So we only have currently Article 6.2 at hand, which is basically bilateral agreements between countries. So that's for setting the scene. I think, why are carbon markets important for development finance? This is because we need all tools in the box to increase financing for climate and for development. And especially in times when national budgets are more constrained, be it in Africa, but also be it in Europe and in other parts of the world. In times where also interest rates on the commercial side are going up, the pressure to find new tools, to be innovative, are even ever increasing. So I think carbon markets and carbon credits can be one tool out of this toolbox, but in order to be a useful tool, it has to be done right. And I'm not sure, you may have followed also the issues that surfaced, especially on the voluntary carbon markets in the last couple of months. They are mostly related to integrity issues, environmental integrity, but also, for example, that the beneficiaries, for example, at the local communities, did not actually reach the benefits of such projects. So it will be important to basically fix these problems. I'll put it on simple terms. I hear a lot from industry here also at that conference about commoditizing carbon credits, about derivatives and futures, etc. In my opinion, we have to tame the dragon first before we unleash it, and not the other way around. And then I believe carbon markets can be a very, very good, a very powerful tool. And maybe my last point to link to that, to also make the segue to nature-based solutions, because that is in some instances probably the most challenging for carbon markets, because there are challenges like how to actually account for the carbon captured in soils, in trees, in forests, etc., in mangroves. That is often not so clear. It is often a challenge about permanence. Carbon has to be sequestered really for the long run, but if soil deteriorates or if it will be used differently, so that there can be easily carbon leakage. So for these nature-based solutions, I think it's particularly challenging. It's a bit easier for solutions like, for example, green cook stoves or green cooling solutions. So and that, I guess, is another challenge. We really have to look at the details, because the challenges are also very sector-specific, and we have to understand these challenges very well in order to come up with solutions that have a high environmental integrity and that really work for the climate.
Thank you so much, and thanks also for identifying that there's so many different kinds of markets and carbon pricing mechanisms, and also the plea to actually, we need all hands on deck. So this is part of the solution, and we just need to figure out how to do it in the right way. And I think you've clearly identified some of those challenges. Let me just check if there's any responses to your comments from amongst yourselves, anything that you've heard that you want to respond to before we open to the audience.
Just one challenge or the comment of who is putting the monetary value on this natural capital.
Right.
As you said, carbon may be a little easier, but then the natural capital has so much of the different value to different people. So I think this governance issue is going to be very, very important. But the bottom line, I mean, the water, that the soil, biodiversity, that every, that the community has a very different way of valuing it. I mean, different reason for valuing it. But I think that that's why this governance mechanism, or then bringing those stakeholders on the ground together to make sure that those different value be accounted for when we try to, or they try to put the monetary value, is going to be exceedingly important. It's challenging, but it shouldn't be the reason why we cannot do it.
No, and thank you for raising the governance issue. And I'm also an environmental economist. I was one of the first environmental economists to join WWF, and worked for many, many years on payments for ecosystem services and economic valuation in the early days, like 25 years ago. And one of the biggest struggles actually was governance. So really putting up solid governance mechanisms. You can monetize things, you can put in place PES mechanisms, but in the end, putting in place a good governance structure where people actually follow up and do what they promise to do so that the money flows where it's supposed to be flowing, I think was the biggest challenge, but why many of them in the early days failed to be fully successful. And I'm wondering, in your case, Nancy, in the experience of Kenya, can you maybe talk a little bit more about your experience on governance models in supporting some of your the work that you do in Kenya?
Thank you. We cannot say as Kenya we have completely figured out the governance, but the step we have taken first is to amend our Climate Act so that we're able to regulate this market. Our carbon market previously was based on the voluntary system, and he has clearly outlined it was most of the projects that were claiming credits, we were not able, for lack of a better word, I would say it's not necessarily small, but fragmented. So we have several projects in the country that are already trading in carbon, but with no regulation and framework. That was until September this year. Right. So what we have done as a government is establish a framework, and the framework then provides the guidelines and the policies that allow them to trade. We cannot say that we are there. I think it is a journey, and we are started the governance side and discussing and working with partners to ensure that we are able to account for most of the rules and allow the voluntary market, for instance, which has now opened up to function appropriately. But nonetheless, for the issues around compliance, is still not functioning. And so then what I could say is just that it's a space that in which we are starting the journey. That would be the better way to put it. Yeah. And we are more seeing a future where now that we have put a deliberate focus to ensure that we account for our carbon market and provide an enabling environment, we are going to see more and more integrity and proper participation. In terms of translating the benefits to the beneficiaries, there has been pockets of projects reporting. The clean cooking is a good example. But nonetheless, if you go to some of the projects for instance, in the eastern part of the country, it's again difficult to account for how much money they collected and if they've actually accounted or given back to the community, the marginalized communities. And how much they have involved women, how much we have youth employed, how many industries have been set up. So going forward, we see a space for us to be able to account for it. And we've put in place the framework that allows us to be able, for people to have a register, account for what you've gotten, what level of finance, and where does that financing go into. So I think if you look at the rallying call our president has been making towards taxes and give us a carbon tax, and let's contribute and then finance our projects. Let's look at it as investment and let's see where the investments are coming from. So I guess we're in a good space, but we are still learning.
Thank you so much. Thank you for sharing that experience. And I think you are taking amazing steps. And your emphasis as well on a strong national policy and governance framework, I think, is hugely important, especially if we do these things at a national level, right? Otherwise. So thank you for that. With that, I'd like to open the floor to the audience to see if there are any questions to the panelists. Please, and then you. Do you have a mic?
No, thank you. Thank you very much for giving me the floor. And thank you very much, speakers, for the wonderful insights that you've shared with us. And I think it is really fantastic. My name is Linus Mofor from the African Climate Policy Center of the Economic Commission for Africa. I think it is really important now that we're taking this issue of valuing Africa's natural capital very seriously, and it's gaining momentum. But I was just wondering, isn't it contradictory that on the one hand, we're doing this, on the other hand, we are seeing a rapid proliferation of voluntary carbon markets, which is basically stripping those assets away. So you're trying to value something, and then on the other side, you're trying to strip out the voluntary carbon markets instead of waiting for the compliance market so that we have real value for Africa's natural assets. And if we continue to promote these voluntary carbon markets with emissions continuing to rise and Africa being impacted the most by climate change, I was just wondering, I would like to hear from the speaker, isn't there something wrong? And how do we ensure that even if we were to do these voluntary carbon markets, how do we ensure that the ton of carbon in Africa has the same value as the ton of carbon in Asia or somewhere else? Otherwise, I think we are contradicting what we're trying to do. Thank you.
Great question. Who would like to respond to that? Maybe you?
Shall I direct you, or are we getting the second question as well?
Maybe you.
Happy to do that. Why don't we do that?
Okay, sure. Thank you. James Reeler, I'm from WWF as well, based in South Africa. I think when we talk about the natural resource accounting, I think it's very valuable, but we have a thing where we tend to focus obviously much more on the flows when we're talking about the market approach than on stock. And so we have something of a mismatch, I guess, when we're looking at the scale. So the accounting for project-based accounting tends to be in a very fine resolution. We're looking at it down in the detail, the number of plants, the change in the soil for sustainable land management. Whereas the whole national flows, you can get good sort of accounting for that, and you can get paid for that. But essentially, your national flows could go in the other direction, but if you don't have the tracking at all levels. So I guess the question is, as we scale the markets, and we're talking about, for the Africa Carbon Markets Initiative, very, very substantial areas that we're thinking about marketizing. How do we think about the jurisdictional nesting of that monitoring and evaluation so that we're really looking at those flows at appropriate scales?
Thank you for that question. Why don't we stick with these two and get a few responses and see if there's space for maybe one more question, and then Kevin, please, I'd like to ask you to close. Why don't you go first?
Happy to start. I guess mainly about the first question. So I mean, the whole idea about carbon credit markets is that it is cheaper to sequester a ton of carbon in some parts in the world than in others. That is the whole reason also on the compliance market that is still in the making, why countries from Europe, for example, engage in carbon credit deals with countries in Africa. So this is, I guess, something we all have to understand, that this is a whole prerequisite for that. If so to say, it would cost the same to reduce the ton of carbon in Switzerland, then Switzerland would have no incentive, at least no price incentive, to pay, for example, Ghana to reduce a ton of carbon. So this is, let's say, the whole basis of that. If we look at carbon pricing more generally, we also have to see that carbon border adjustments, like the CBAM, the European CBAM, will definitely impact the debate we'll be having in the next couple of years a lot, because maybe for those who are not familiar, currently we have an allowance system in Europe in certain sectors, so they have to pay a carbon price that's already around for more than 15 years, but only in the, let's say, last couple of years, actually prices are really material. So now the problem is that for these industries that are affected by the ETS, it becomes attractive to shift their production, for example, on iron and steel, outside of the European Union. This is called a leakage. And the production of these goods could be even dirtier than inside of the European Union, because, for example, more coal is used for electricity generation. So, putting a long story short, at the end of the day, we need somehow a globally aligned carbon pricing system. And this is, I guess, where let's say the journey is going to, but I think this is still a long journey. And a part of the question is how to get there and what to do in the meantime, because we don't have the time, of course, to just come up with such a regime in 20, 30 years. There's also a lot we have to do right now.
Thank you. Panel, Professor Noko, would you like to respond to the questions?
I am not really following the carbon market, but I just want to respond very, very shortly.
Please.
That the natural capital, both stock and flow, have to be captured under the natural capital accounting. So that's something we need to work on.
Thank you so much. Any other? Oh God, there are a lot of questions. So we have 8 minutes, and I really would like to give Kevin the floor. So we'll take one more question. Okay. I'm very sorry. And then Kevin, please come up and also respond to some questions and close.
Thank you, moderator. Thank you, panelist Patrick Arani from African Union. Question is very more or less simple and complex. The complexity of carbon tax and voluntary carbon market. I know, Nancy, maybe your regulation and so on, you are working about carbon tax.
Sorry, can you speak up a bit?
Yeah, I'm trying to understand. Maybe either one of you can respond. Like for one country, pushing for carbon tax at the same time, wanting to participate in voluntary carbon market. Would there be potential kind of conflict, or how would this work in reality?
Yeah.
Thank you. Why don't you respond and close?
So as I said at the beginning, for the sake of simplicity, I would see it as two separate things. However, there are ways to integrating it. For example, Singapore has just introduced a regime where they have a carbon tax, and part of basically of the costs you have as a company paying the carbon taxes, you can offset with carbon credits that you can buy. Also in earlier times, for example, part within the European ETS, you could offset a part of the duties you had to pay through CDM credits. this has been abolished for good reasons. However, so in the future, I think this can be an integrated system. For building it up, I think there speaks a lot for basically treating it separately, because, as I said at the beginning, for the carbon credit markets, we are currently facing those integrity problems, and I think we have to fix them first before relying too much on them. Maybe
right,
one word of advertisement, if you allow me. With GIZ and the Mercator Research Institute on Global Commons and Climate Change, we have launched a tool called the Carbon Pricing Incidence Calculator a couple of days ago, which is a tool that can basically model the impact of carbon prices, the distributional impacts of carbon prices, be it through a tax or something else, on different population groups. So I think this is also of interest here, maybe for this discussion, because what you also have to see is when you introduce a carbon price, first of all, things get more expensive. However, there are ways how to make a carbon price not just pro-climate, but also pro-poor. I think this calculator can help in doing such analysis.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much. And I apologize to all the many questions. This is obviously a hugely important topic with a lot of interest, but I wish we had more time, but I really would like to give the floor, Kevin, to you to close the session and hear your reflections on the discussion. Thank you.
First, I would like to, please, if you allow me, we've negotiated some float with time with the organizers of the pavilion. The point around the questions asked by the two colleagues there are at the crux of why we are doing this. First, I do not agree, and I hope there are many others who will also not agree with the thinking that it is cheaper to sequester carbon in one part of the world than in the other. Reason is, first, climate change is a global commons challenge. So, and each one of us are global citizens, and we cannot differentiate the value of lives on the planet based on where one lives or does not live. And that's what I alluded to in my opening, that poverty is defining the price of carbon in Africa. Because of the high discount rate of the poor generally prefers $1 today than $2 billion tomorrow, because it's a survival. You want to survive today and go over tomorrow. And for African governments listening, I would say, please don't sell the future of your country's assets by engaging in voluntary markets that you don't know the actual price of what you're selling. I think it's just very basic. Second, as I mentioned in the beginning, if you look at the climate change discussion, we all know that climate change has been created because of economic activities. And we also know that these economic activities generate social well-being for citizens because of growth in, you have electricity, you have roads, you have everything, and that impacts on the livelihoods of people. So if you look at the carbon credit of the world up to today, and the carbon credits are accruable based on the carbon budget of the world, Africa today has up to $4.8 trillion in carbon credits. And that is an analysis using the current social cost of carbon. If we start differentiating the cost of carbon, what we are going to see is poorer countries selling their carbon assets to richer countries for the future. And then once sold, you cannot use it as part of your nationally determined contributions. So please don't do it. So that's number one for me. And so the question that was asked by the colleague from the Africa Climate Policy Center is very spot on. If we have to solve a global challenge, we need global coalition. So if we are going to have a global carbon market, the compliance market, let's agree on the price of carbon, just like we have the prices of cars. And we have the prices of, I mentioned in the beginning, there's already technology for carbon sequestration. And those prices are not set by whether you are poor or rich. It's set by the price of producing that technology. So if a carbon sequestration technology, I was in a meeting with mayors on financing cities, and one mayor said an entrepreneur came to them with a technology for sequestering carbon. What's the price of the technology? $250,000 to sequester a particular level of carbon. And then he said, but I have the forests doing it, and I get no money for those forests that are sequestering that carbon. Why would I buy your technology at this fixed price? So we need to think very carefully about how we push the voluntary carbon market and the carbon credits, because it can actually lead to greater inequities and also rob the continent that have huge carbon assets of their assets simply because of poverty that defines the immediate value of money. So what we are trying to do is that we actually have the valuation of that natural assets. It doesn't matter where you are, the price of carbon should be the price of carbon. And then if that price of carbon is applied to the global assets, whether it be a technology that sequesters carbon or a tree that sequesters carbon, what we are trading is carbon. And the price of carbon should be the same for everybody. So if we did that by integrating it into, and thank you, my dear sister from Kenya, and also my sister from Japan, if we integrate this into the social accounting matrices for countries, and we're able to build the positive or negative externalities of my economic activity into my gross domestic product, then I will start listening. Because if I'm polluting, that value will be negative. If I'm producing services, that value will be positive. And GDP is simply the measure, economic value of goods and services produced by a country during a particular period. Normally, we talk about annually. So if I'm producing huge services to the world in terms of sequestering carbon through my forests, I should be paid as well as that technology person who develops a technology that does the same service, because the service is the same. So this is what we're trying to do. And by all the hands we see raised, we know that this is a touchy issue. The methodology is not yet fully developed. We have data issues. My sister has talked about it. We have regulatory issues that has been talked about. But if we don't address it, we may continue to negotiate for another 28 years. We're now on 28 COP. We may continue to negotiate for another 28 years, and declarations are made, and people will go back and watch what? GDP. Because in the end, that's what will put countries into G7 or G10 or G20, or the measure of how well countries are doing. And politicians will respond to that figure, because that's what they are measured against. So in terms of concluding, let me just try to summarize some of the things that has been raised. Number one, what I take from this is that there's quite a lot of issues that we still need to address. And one action I'm going to call for is that we will call a virtual meeting. 1 hour, 2 hours, 3 hours is not enough for us to address all these issues. We'll try and convene a virtual meeting, and I encourage you, come, bring your experts, national offices of bureaus of statistics, your macroeconomists, your environmental economists. Let us debate the methodology and come up with a framework that can help us to do this and integrate them into the social accounting matrices. Two, Institutionalization of the methodology is another thing that will come when we all agree on a method. But let's work on that framework and come up with one. 3, valuing natural capital, whether stocks or flows. Thank you, my sister. You have already addressed that. We shouldn't exclude any. Whatever the data we can get, we will try to build them into that work that is going to be done. The need for capacity building and technical assistance at country level is fundamental because some countries like Kenya, because of leadership by President Ruto, may prioritize this, but others may not. So we really need a lot of work with countries to help build the data and move forward. For me, we're trying to use a market-based approach to greening economies. Because if we're able to build the first lessons I learned in environmental economics is about internalization of externalities. That's all that drove the valuation, that work that we were all doing and so on. And if we're able to do that internalization into the GDP by building the value of natural capital into that GDP, the services that was produced by natural capital, that will help quite a lot. Is it a challenging thing to do? Yes. But we should not shy away from addressing difficult issues. Because I know if we all put our minds together, we will be able to make that happen. Regulatory framework remains a challenge, and let us all work together on that and try and move that forward. On proliferation of voluntary carbon markets, I would call for caution so that we can try and make sure that we do not again sell off the future carbon assets of the continent. And then in terms of whether we're measuring stocks or flows, that's already been addressed. And in terms of whether the price of carbon should be the same everywhere, my answer is a big yes. And with that, I would like to thank all of us for coming. Thank you all for the questions. Those who still have questions, we will have that virtual platform. Let's continue this conversation and be able to address this issue. And I like the point you made in the other panel. The reason why we have not changed in climate discussions is because we have not changed the metrics. I'm quoting someone sitting here in another place. So let us try and change the metrics of how we measure the wealth of nations, and nations will listen to the climate discussions and climate negotiations. Thank you very much.